All right. We got everything. Squeaky, squeaky chair. Drippy, drippy filter on my fish tank. So anyway, I found myself thinking the last couple of days obsessively about video games. And then I realized this morning I don't need to think obsessively about video games, or in my case, not think about video games. I can talk about them to myself right here, because no one can tell me what I can or can't talk about, and this is ostensibly a video game channel. So, I have been seeing going around, I believe the space is called X now. I don't know if you would call it a meme, but I've been seeing I guess it's a starter for conversation asking if Naruto, Bleach, and One Piece are the big three of anime. What are the big three of JRPGs? And I see a lot of people include in the big three both Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. And I've been thinking obsessively on this topic because I'm not sure that can be right. And so I've been trying to think in my head what the big three mean. And so I looked prior to sitting down here, after knowing exactly what I was going to be talking about. I did a modicum of research and I looked, and the oldest of those three, One Piece, Naruto, and Bleach, is, I believe, One Piece at 1997. Okay, so if we're talking big threes, and our big three was started in 97, it's hard for me to include two titles that are also from the 80s in Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. But that's not what I think should disqualify one or the other of them. It's not even that they're both from Square, because they were both Squaresoft titles. They weren't a Square and an Enix title. And so part of me wants to say, okay, well, one of them has to be disqualified, and you have to have an Enix title, because you can't have, like, I think what I most take umbrage with, and what I actually sat down to start talking about what I most thought about, is that most people, it seemed, agreed that it was Pokemon, Final Fantasy, and Dragon Quest were the big three. Pokemon was the one that I meant to say third, not the one that I meant to begin with, but it was the one I was thinking about making sure I said, so I said it first, whatever. So I buried the lead there, but no, I didn't. I did the opposite of burying the lead. Anyway, any list that includes Pokemon, Dragon Quest, or that includes Pokemon with Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy is a strange list to me. It's a list that hasn't really thought about itself, because Pokemon isn't a JRPG. It can't be. I know that you want to say, oh, the party system and the turn-based combat, and we'll talk about why Pokemon isn't a JRPG, but how it is wearing JRPG skin in a moment, because I'm still trying to articulate why Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest don't belong on a list that is only 3 titles long. And so there should be an Enix title, which means that there should be one of the Star Ocean games should be on that list. So it should maybe be Star Ocean, Final Fantasy, if I'm just going with my biases. And I'm going to explain why my biases are the biases of the people that are responding to this question, and how our biases are wrong in a moment. So Final Fantasy and Star Ocean, and then there was another huge JRPG in the 90s. I believe it was called Phantasy Star, Phantasy Star. I believe it was on the Sega. I never played it. Like that feels like it should be on there, because Phantasy Star, didn't it get an MMO? But I think that it was probably also an Enix title, which means that it can't be. It doesn't feel like it belongs on the list with another Enix title, because I'm pretty sure that Star Ocean is an Enix title, and so so that gets me thinking. And one thing that I haven't seen anybody mention is the Harvest Moon series. I feel like the Rune Factory games, which spawned the Harvestella game, I feel like they're a JRPG. I feel like Harvest Moon is a JRPG because I think that we're getting hung up. I think we're getting hung up on identifying markers and not on philosophical being. And so if this is a channel where I use the tools that I've acquired via reading and listening to philosophers and great thinkers, and I'm applying them to everyday subjects that people want to play philosopher about, but because there's no standard for thought, anyone can have any interpretation and anyone can say anything they want. And I'm gonna apply that to video games for a little while. Because what I told you I was going to do today is I was going to tell you what I'm doing and why. And so let me just do that let me just do it. Instead of telling you, let me just do it in an obvious way. And so let's talk about video games. And so, like, before we can say what the big three JRPGs are, we're supposed to define what a JRPG is. But I want to look a little more closely at what Naruto, One Piece, and Bleach represent among manga and among anime. Because they weren't talking specifically about the manga. And so the manga of One Piece, I believe, stretches back to 1997. But I'm not sure any of these anime stretch back before 2000. And so, to me, if you're going to say that the big three modern anime/manga are contemporary with the 2000s, I don't think it makes sense to include JRPG titles, video game titles from the 80s. Because Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, their sensibilities are sensibilities from the 1980s. They don't have modern sensibilities. And so the modern big three franchises, because that's what we're really talking about, big three franchises. If we're talking about big three franchises, we have to talk about big three franchises that have remained contemporary. That have remained consistent is the word I meant to use. Remain consistent in their releases, as in releasing a title every year or two or three, consistently releasing titles, but also they're consistent in their philosophy of being a JRPG. And so I saw a lot of people suggest Tales, and I think Tales is a better example, and I'll explain why. Because my inclination is to disinclude Tales for my biases. So let's talk about why my bias includes Final Fantasy and why I think your bias includes Dragon Quest, and why both of our biases are so inclined to include Pokemon. So I said I wanted to look. I'm going to do that. We're going to do that. I said I'm going to do that, but what I want to do is I want to look at specifically what these anime are, because it doesn't make sense to do that thing without looking at what these anime mean and the context of anime. Because it's like I accidentally replaced, and engaging in the conversation, I accidentally replaced One Piece with Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, the whole Dragon Ball franchise, the continuum of Dragon Ball. And a person pointed out to me that I had done that, and that they were right, and I said, oh, and that I was wrong for having done that, and I was like, oh, you're totally right. My fingers just replaced One Piece because I hate it. And so they said to me what is obvious to me, but needs to be said, because it's not obvious to everyone that's going to engage in this conversation. And that is that just because they're the big three doesn't necessarily mean they're the best. It doesn't necessarily mean they're the best, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the most popular. So the big three are really where kids get hooked, it seems to be. And the big three anime are broadly shonen anime, so I believe that's what that's called. They're fighting adventure anime. And so what they share in common is that they're broadly violent, that they have a lot of filler in the anime, and that they're character driven. So they're like a sit action. So instead of a situational comedy, they're like situational action. So situational adventure. Okay. But I don't think that anyone would argue, and I've already said this, but they're not the best. It's not that Naruto or Bleach or One Piece are particularly good. It's that they're a really good introductory place for someone who has no negative bias toward anime. They're a really good place to get started with the shonen genre in general. And the reason that Dragon Ball and its continuum isn't included is because Dragon Ball leans a little bit more adult, I think. It leans, and by more adult, I mean it leans more toward that adrenaline and hormone-fueled moment around 17 to 19. So it's more adolescent. Okay, so when I said that maybe Final Fantasy shouldn't be included in the list, because I think that that's where I'm ultimately going, is that I think that ultimately what I'm obsessing over is that Final Fantasy doesn't belong among the big three, and that maybe Tales does, and where they branch from one another is that Tales is almost obstinately preteen. It's almost deliberately immature. To the point that it's derivative of more mature fiction and more mature fantasy, specifically more mature dark fantasy, but I wouldn't say oppressively optimistic. I would say it's almost painfully childish in its presentation. And so that makes me think of Naruto in a lot of ways. And okay, so Tales makes sense to me as one of the big three. Even if it's not the most played, you can sit someone who's never played a JRPG down in front of Tales with its hybrid of action and turn-based combat, and its hybrid of romantic sims like in American RPGs and romance building, and then they can feel their way through a lot of American or Western gamers' first introduction to any JRPG at all was a Tales game, simply because they are a good introduction. And so that makes sense to me. But then that suggests to me that Final Fantasy can't be on that list, and I've already said that Pokemon doesn't belong. So let's talk about what a JRPG is then, since Final Fantasy, I think, can't be on the list, because while a JRPG, and while 7, especially, once you're talking about the post-2000 RPG market, Final Fantasies 7, 8, and 10 were played by a lot of people, and a lot of people that were unfamiliar with the genre. But those games specifically, 7, 8, and 10, those all skew toward college students. Those all skewed toward young adults and late adolescent. And One Piece is about children who are pirates, and Bleach is about high schoolers who are angels of death, and so that doesn't skew toward college students. And the kinds of things that a post-college or post-high school life are going to present to you, that's not what those are doing. So Final Fantasy is excluded. Final Fantasy can't be among the big three. Because Final Fantasy is Dragon Ball. Because Final Fantasy has a little bit of everything. It has a lot of action. It has a lot of adrenaline. It has a lot of filler. But it also has some light, fluffy, easy romances, because the game mechanics don't have a place for a romance sim. And so that leads me with an open space, and I would like to disqualify the other open space before we move on to the Shin Megami Tensei series, and whether it fits, because I think Tails fits, and I think Pokemon does not fit. And so why doesn't Pokemon fit? And so Pokemon is a good place for us to discuss what exactly a JRPG is. And so I think a lot of people are confused about what an RPG is, a role-playing game. So by the definitions of the word, it's a game in which you play a role. Every single game is an RPG. There's no game where you don't have a role that you are playing within the context of the game. That's what a game is to play a role. So what does that mean, to role play? Well, it's when you hear people talk about it around a D&D table, oh, we want more role play and less game, right? Less combat, for instance, fewer roles. Role play is that organic feeling like the character to a lot of people. So like when you play a game like Horizon Zero Dawn, that's technically a role playing game because the game wants you to dive into the headspace, the role of, and to, while you play it, become and role play as Aloy, I believe her name is. But like Doom doesn't particularly care about your headspace experience as the character, the Doom guy. They didn't even give him a name. So that's not a role-playing game. The game itself isn't to play the role of Doom. Playing the role of Doom guy, in a lot of ways is the game, because the role of Doom guy is to kill the Doom monsters or whatever. But it's not a role-playing game in that way. I'm not making the distinction clear. I know that I'm confusing it in that way that I said before, the muddying up, not so much the making a pretty shade of blue. But I think that in the Western market, what a role-playing game is there are certain key elements, and I think a stat sheet is one of them. Managing and developing a character's stats, and their character growth through a game. And so that means choices about developing them. And so those choices often mean dialogue. And so that the JRPG in a lot of ways is different from the perspective of role-playing than Western games. So this used to be a big debate in the 90s and the early aughts, and it's gone away now because the genres they've largely closed themselves off. So like RPGs are no longer really trying to appeal to a mass market, and then also there's less genre gatekeeping. So fans of first-person shooters will play RPGs now, and it used to be the case that they wouldn't. And a lot of that is Bethesda, because of Skyrim, not Skyrim specifically, but the Elder Scrolls games, and specifically the one that I'm completely forgetting, Fallout. Turning Fallout into a first-person shooter opened the door for a lot of people that were shooter fans to get into RPGs, and for a lot of RPG fans to get into shooters and to get into to think about video games and about role-playing within a video game in a different way. But to say JRPG is to be calling back to a tradition which really does harken back to the 80s and the 90s, and so I know that I said that I think that these games which were from the 80s and the 90s should be disqualified because these anime that we're relating to them to are from the 2000s. They're 20 years later. The big four in metal were in the 80s. And the big three in anime is hearkening to the big four of metal. So I can disqualify my own opinions pretty quickly if it's necessary for me to get to an answer within 2 hours. And I'm only 20 minutes in, so I can waffle for quite a while on this, actually. Longer before I need to pretend like I know what the fuck I'm talking about. But in order for me to talk about why Pokemon's not a JRPG, I would like to have a pretty clear understanding of what a JRPG is without relying on negative definition. So JRPGs, but we're going to rely on negative definition a little bit here. JRPGs do have they do have character sheets, but frequently in JRPGs you're not expected to allot points. So the difference, and these are going to be games post, I know, much later than the tradition of the 80s that I'm talking about, but if you're talking about like the difference in Mass Effect and Final Fantasy X, you still have a fairly large roster of characters, and those characters are interchangeable. And rather, you can move the party is a small number, so probably four people for this example, and you can swap out 3 of them because you have your guy that is you, in this case Shepard or Tidus, and then you can swap people out and you can make them better. But in Mass Effect, you are making choices about where you're allotting points to your party members, what weapons they're wearing, like what weapon specializations they use, what skills they choose, out of their trees, these sorts of things. Now, I know that you can set it up to be automatic because even Mass Effect was trying to, by being a third-person shooter, was actually trying to take the RPG genre and cross-class it, if we're going to use RPG terminology, with the third-person shooter or third-person action genre, which was really popular at the time. So really what Mass Effect, especially by Mass Effect 3, what you really are playing is a third-person shooter with RPG elements. And so that's what we're talking about when we say what is an RPG, because what an RPG is nonsense. That's a nonsensical title. But what it implies is a certain sort of gameplay, and that gameplay is that you're trying to develop your characters. You're trying to develop them in power, and you're trying to develop them in story. And so, like, a lot of the reason that Final Fantasy is on that list is because, like, Final Fantasy VI is a tour de force of that. Every character has a unique development, so as they gain levels, they get unique skills and abilities that they can use in combat, but you can equip your espers in such a way that you can make choices about the specific ways in which their stats develop every level. And then they also have, while not branching, very deep narrative stories for each individual character as you collect them, and I think there's like 16 or 13 of them or something like that. But that's not typical of JRPGs, and that's why we've disqualified Final Fantasy from being among the big 3, because Final Fantasy, while also skewing toward adults, is also too experimental. The games are too dissimilar they're too dissimilar from one another among the franchise. So, like, 16 is so dramatically different from 2 that they may as well be a different franchise. They don't have even similar combat mechanics or gameplay mechanics, not just graphics. Just like I include and I insist on the Tales, because the Tales games, you can pick up any Tales game and it feels like any other, just where it is on the chronological release, if that makes sense. So, like, the ones on the PS2 feel different from the ones on the PS1, feel different from Arise, I think, is the most recent one to be released. But they're all Tales games. They all play like a Tales game, and they all have the narrative elements of a Tales game, and they all have yada yada yada, the world building elements of a Tales game. They feel like a Tales game. Where, like, Final Fantasy, the only way that it feels like Final Fantasy in the same way as the previous one, especially after 10-2 and after the original director, is that Yoshinori Kitase? Did I get that right? Probably not. After he left Squeenix, the games, they become even feel different from one another. They become different genre of games. Like 11 is a different, like they even go online. So let's get off that, because I've disqualified 11 and I'm defining through negative attribution. And so the Japanese version of an RPG, and why it has that J distinction versus the W Western distinction, and we no longer have the Western distinction. It's now either an RPG or a JRPG. So anyway, the Western distinction, the reason what makes a JRPG and distinguishes it from a Western RPG is a very, very, very linear gameplay plot. So you're not playing Hitman in Final Fantasy. Like there aren't multiple ways to solve the problems like there are in Fallout. The first 2 Fallout games, there are multiple ways to get through every problem, and that's because your character can be developed as a blank slate to solve problems in multiple ways, and that's that particular way to encourage replayability. But that thing is what people are talking about when they say more role play and less combat or less gameplay at a D&D table, is that they're not actually trying to play a game, they're trying to play a life sim. And really that's what the Western RPG is these are more like, I don't remember what they call them, but they're basically life sims. So like if you think about the really big PC RPGs that as in personal computer RPGs that got really big around the time that we're talking it's not called BioShock, System Shock I think just recently got a remake or a remaster or whatever, and that game it's a life sim. Like that's not what they call it. I don't think that's what they call it, but it's that kind of RPG, like being like in the Elder Scrolls or in System Shock, or I'm trying to think of, because they got real popular for a while and then they stopped having any sort of gameplay, and then that culminated in the Stanley Parable, and then basically since then the medium has all but disappeared until the System Shock remake or remaster or whatever, and then people were shocked by what an RPG could be like if it wasn't about grinding combat, if it was about role-playing and not about game. And so I've wandered off that topic, but that gets us to why Pokemon isn't actually an RPG, is that Pokemon doesn't actually have any role-playing. It doesn't actually have any role-playing elements. And I know that what you're saying to yourself is, but it's turn-based combat, and but you've got the varied party, and but you're trying to develop them. It's got levels and a stat sheet, and they all have abilities, and they develop, and yada yada yada. But that's exactly what I mean when I'm talking about the JRPG versus Western RPG distinction. Is it can look, when you make that distinction and you divorce the RPG from the RP and you just make it about the G and the development and the growth of the characters and the making the numbers bigger, and the numbers bigger are the bigger score, and they make you do more damage, and they make you be more interesting. That's how you can confuse the most recent 3 Assassin's Creed games, the one in Greece, the one in Egypt, and the one in with the Vikings. That's how you can confuse those with RPGs, because you can say, oh well, they have RPG elements because you're doing those things, but those are interesting and they're fun and they're great, but those aren't what make an RPG. Like a stat sheet does not an RPG make. And so what is the Japanese RPG is in a lot of ways the sweeping storyline in combination with, and a lot of times in combination with crafting elements, and it's really about the grinding in the maps on the world. And so like, as I'm disqualifying Pokemon, even though it's all of those things, I'm saying that Pokemon is a collectathon. Pokemon's a monster tamer. Like, you wouldn't say monster tamer slash RPG, and you wouldn't say about Pokemon that it's an RPG slash monster tamer, because your character has no development. Your character doesn't develop. Your character has almost no character. Your character has almost no presence in the world whatsoever. And that can't be a JRPG, because your character is the most important thing to an RPG, making, like, especially if you look at JRPGs as they understand themselves and as they've understood themselves since about the PS3 era. So, like, especially if you look at NIS, the Nippon Ichi Software, and if you look at Compile Heart, and I'm trying to remember the other one. I've got a cat meowing in the other room. Every time I try to remember the name, the cat meows and it gets me all messed up. I'm trying to remember the name of the company that releases the Hyperdimension Neptunia games. Gust? Is that right? The companies that are actually releasing JRPGs today, that actually seem to have put some thought into what is the philosophy that makes a JRPG and not a Western RPG. It's engagement with it's a much deeper engagement with the combat system, but it's also an understanding that even if your main character, it's an acknowledgement that even if the goal is to make your party members super powerful, your main character is still the power fantasy. Like, you are still the power fantasy. So, like, I'm thinking about like Fairy Fencer F, and there's a whole series of games like that using the Hyperdimension Neptunia combat system, where the goal is it flips the Hyperdimension Neptunia idea on its head. And so Hyperdimension Neptunia does not belong in the top three, in the big three JRPGs conversation, because it's such a niche title. Too few people have played it. It doesn't correlate well to Bleach or to Naruto, to Bleach or to One Piece, because I think I've already assigned Naruto to I guess I've just been allowing Dragon Quest to sit there. No, to Tails. I disqualified. Well, I have left Dragon Quest off because it's probably going to be included, but I would like to exclude it. I would like to disqualify Dragon Quest, because I don't think enough people in the West actually play Dragon Quest for Westerners to include Dragon Quest in the big three. Now, it obviously deserves inclusion in Japan, but that's a phenomena all in and of itself. Kind of like how the former guitarist of Megadeth is huge in Japan. Like, some things are just huge in Japan. But it's impossible also to say that that Dragon Quest doesn't belong in the discussion as obviously in the big three, because everybody uses slimes. Everybody uses their monsters. Everybody either uses Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy's monsters in their base bestiary. They use Dragon Quests because Dragon Quest's monsters are interesting and unique, and they use Final Fantasies because they're the D&D bestiary. So, yeah. I was talking about Fairy Fencer F and games like that, and Hyperdimension Neptunia, where the idea is to make your party members better, and that the power of friendship rules the day. But that seems to be what JRPGs are. So, like, the JRPG seems to be this deep, grueling grind to make your characters better, but at the end of the day, it's this long story about how love and friendship, overcome all obstacles. And so Hyperdimension Neptunia really stands out to me because there are so many games, but I think that it came out too late in order to be counted, because it was closer to 2010 when that franchise started, and that franchise was already homaging and ripping off an existent tradition, a tradition that had already existed for damn near 40 years by that point. So, well, 30 years for sure. I was pushing JRPGs back into the 70s. Like, I have any idea. I don't know why they wouldn't. So, I think that maybe those titles... but if you want Pokemon to be in there, I think that what we have to do is that we have to really stop and we have to think to ourselves whether tactical RPGs, tactical JRPGs count. Because if you want to broaden JRPG out to include tactical JRPGs like Final Fantasy Tactics, Dragon Quest, Ogre Battle, or specifically the one I'm thinking of, Disgaea, then your conversation becomes interesting to me, because the JRPG in a lot of ways is the tactical RPG, because what a JRPG is doing is it's trying really hard to take tabletop RPG like D&D and make it cinematic, make it look neat. That's what JRPGs have been doing since Final Fantasy VII. That's why Final Fantasy has come completely off the rails since 11, and especially since 12. I mean, 16 isn't even turn-based. It's not even trying to imitate turn-based. Like, Kingdom Hearts, at least, was a hybrid. Kingdom Hearts 1, Kingdom Hearts 2, Kingdom Hearts 2, and Kingdom Hearts 3 were a hybrid, and then the intermediate releases were hybrids that were further hybridized. Like hybrids that further cross-classed. So I wonder if Disgaea doesn't belong on that list, because I would say that what belongs on the list is Ogre Battle, but Ogre Battle hasn't continued to consistently release updates to the canon. So you've got Ogre Battle, and then I believe you've got Ogre Battle 64, and then you've got Ogre Battle Tactics. And that seems to be Ogre Battle's contribution to JRPGs. But their influence is massive. So if they're not included, obviously Final Fantasy Tactics can't be included. That genre, though, is huge. Even Fairy Fencer F is releasing, or has released, in fact, I think, already, a tactical RPG, a tactical JRPG version of itself. The Advanced Wars series, which is huge, and has influenced video games in a massive way, was borrowing heavily from Ogre Battle, which means that I have to include in the big three, absolutely must necessarily include the game that I can never remember the title, Sword, Fire Emblem. Has to include Fire Emblem. And that nobody mentioned Fire Emblem means that this conversation is flawed from the get-go, because I don't think people would tell you that Fire Emblem is a JRPG, but I think Nintendo would insist that Fire Emblem is a JRPG, and isn't just a JRPG, but it defines JRPGs with every release. It defines how people think about JRPG with every release. Because it has everything. It has the stats, it has the linear story, it has the friendship element, but it also has Western elements with the relationship sim and all of that business. I've never played a Fire Emblem game deep enough to have an informed education or an informed opinion about this, but it has to, because Fire Emblem is Disgaea's main competitor, and Disgaea continues to release games. They're up to their 7th title. I think they're releasing another one. The 7th one, I think. Might be they just released the 7th one, and I haven't gotten around to it yet. Or maybe they're about to release the 8th. I don't remember. It doesn't matter. I love those games, but I never finish them. I play them for 100 hours and realize that I'm only on chapter 5, and I go, why am I playing this game still? Because they're JRPGs, and it's about the combat. It's about the combat. Everything goes through the combat in a JRPG. Where in Western RPGs, you're almost trying to avoid combat. Like in Skyrim, like the developers almost punish you if you want to play the game as a fighter. And by a fighter, I mean somebody who's just trying to engage in combat the whole game. And that's where the distinction comes from. I think I already said that, right? It's the RP versus the G. So like I tend to only play JRPGs as far as RPGs go because they're about the G, not the RP. The RP to me is tedious and boring. I don't like to read. The voice acting is always bad, and the choices almost never have anything whatever to do with what I said. And so like Mass Effect, you just pick blue or you just pick red and you just skip cutscenes because what's going to play out doesn't matter and the game was dumb anyway. But I don't tend to like Western RPGs because Western RPGs tend to have a massive amount of hype around them, and the reason that they have a massive amount of hype around them is because back in the day, you couldn't sell RPGs. You couldn't sell a Western RPG to a mass audience. It was a niche thing that would usually get your company canned for trying. Like your company would collapse if you tried to release an RPG, and so they had to be mass marketed to compete with the JRPGs that were selling, but also to convince the people who thought that the whole idea, like me, is stupid would give it a chance. And so that's why after Interplay went tits up and Bethesda bought Fallout, that's why around that 5-year span, everybody was hybridizing their RPGs because BioWare had made KOTOR, and it did all right, but it was a niche title. Now, they released it on Xbox, which made it a niche title. If they had released it on the PlayStation, it would have been the biggest game in the universe, but they chose to release it through Microsoft, through the very company that did so much to make RPGs not work for PC anyway. But RPGs have also always had a bad rap for not being graphically advanced, and you can see that in retro RPGs. Like everybody's trying to copy Chrono Trigger. Everybody is trying to copy Chrono Trigger to the point that it's annoying that they forget to make their own game. They don't make a good Chrono Trigger, and they forget to make a good game, like their own game. I'm thinking specifically like Chris Tales. I really did not like that game. After I got to about the 3rd or 4th chapter, it just started to really grate on me how much back and forth I had to do, how many loading screens I had to look at. This got really tedious, and I don't like games that only tell me like go see Bill. I'm really bad at learning people's names, so not saying hey go to the carpenter Bill or hey go see Bill, he's probably in his office in this place over here in town. I hate that. I don't mind dialogue clues, but we're not talking about that. I'm not doing a broad critique of video games. I'm trying to figure out what the big 3 are, and so I think that I've come down. Tales and Fire Emblem. And so I have to talk about Dragon Quest because it seems so obvious that Square Enix, the company that made JRPGs cool in the West, deserves to have their place enshrined among the big 3, but people don't play those games. Though, like if you're gonna introduce someone to a JRPG, you're not going to say play Final Fantasy VII because look at it now. You're not going to tell somebody to play a retro game, and you're most certainly not going to tell them to play Final Fantasy 15 because that was a steaming pile of dog shit. So maybe it's Zelda. In fact, it has to be Zelda. It has to be Zelda for the very reasons that Pokemon isn't. For the very reason that Pokemon, that your character is a blank slate and you aren't playing a role, isn't a JRPG. Zelda is. Zelda is the JRPG. Huh. I came to a conclusion inside 2 hours. This one only took 44 minutes, 45 now. Yeah, it's got to be Zelda. It's got to be... It has to be Zelda because everybody plays. Wow. I said that one company can't have two. I disqualified Squeenix from having two, and then I gave them none, and then now I'm trying to say that Nintendo gets two, which is interesting because Zelda's old and so big in that way, but Zelda is an RPG. You're developing Link. You get to name your guy. That's your guy. And even though he's got the personality of a cardboard box, you're doing all of the things. You're doing quests. You're saving the world. You and what you do are the most important thing. You are making choices. And you do ultimately make choices on how you develop. As much as I hated Breath of the Wild, I mean, you do pick your weapons. You do yada yada. And you do get to creatively problem solve like a Western RPG. Once. That's why everybody in the West loves and has always loved Zelda. So does that disqualify? Does that disqualify Fire Emblem? Because Fire Emblem is hugely derivative of the Ogre Battle series. Which then makes you wonder, like, okay, so are the Devil May Cry games, are they RPGs? I don't think so. Not in the Japanese sense. I mean, you get, they're Japanese video games in that there's character development and you gain levels in an abstract sense, but I don't think that the Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, I don't think that those count as JRPGs. Those count as video games, Japanese video games, and Japanese video games tend to be video games. They tend to be games, they tend to be fun, so you tend to have scores, they tend to have replayability, and you getting better now that you have better gear or whatever. But they tend to have an arcade sentiment that Western games don't. Western games tend to try to maintain a tabletop sentiment of returning to this ever-enriching, deepening, unfolding story. And exactly the way that Mass Effect gave you the interconnected stories, and I don't know what the hell is going on that every developer of video games hasn't done that since. It can't be that difficult. But I mean, even BioWare fucked it up with Dragon Age Inquisition, so it must be that difficult. And so I'm asking the question of whether I've disqualified Fire Emblem. I always want to call that game Burning Sword, and I really don't know why. Or Zelda. The thing is, like, even Final Fantasy now is competing to be Zelda. And the tactical RPG, I don't know if it's those kinds of RPG were really popular on PC, but I don't know, I can't think off the top of my head of a single American developer that still likes grid-based games that's not named Firaxis. I know that there are other 4X titles, but 4X isn't RPG, and Firaxis is constantly trying to figure out how to make tactical RPGs. But Disgaea is the only long-running tactical RPG that I can think of. And having, I mean, I know Final Fantasy. See, and Final Fantasy isn't a genre either. It's an identity. It became a brand almost. I mean, obviously it was a brand, but I mean like a label. It became like a label, like less this is a Final Fantasy game than this is an RPG made in Japan that we want to sell well in the West. Man. And I'm trying to think of another long-running action RPG that people play. The thing is, I don't think, because it has to be a beginner, it has to be entry level, it has to be something that young people like, that young people are willing to go ape shit about. And so, like, Kingdom Hearts is a no. Kingdom Hearts isn't where you tell people to start with action RPGs. Kingdom Hearts is where you tell people to go when they're like, man, I really need a new JRPG, like action JRPG. And then, like, the action JRPG, maybe Ys. Maybe Ys would be better than Zelda. Yeah, I like that. So are the big three Ys... I've done it again. Fire Emblem and... What was my original supposition? Tales. Ys, Tales, and Fire Emblem. That seems like an argument that I can live with, because I don't necessarily like any of those games. It does leave out the last element of the JRPG thing, and that's the crafting. Crafting and self-sustainability, like in the Harvest Moon, Tales of Seasons type games. And so I don't know where to put them on the list, but the Atelier games belong on the list. There are so many of them. Gust makes Atelier, not Hyperdimension Neptunia. I can't remember. They work with Compile Heart, but I really can't remember what the name of that developer is, and it doesn't matter at this point. But the Atelier series belongs in the discussion. I just don't know. I don't know where they fit. The Atelier series is as J as RPGs get. They're so friendship rules the day, so saccharine sweet. They hurt my teeth, but I love them so much. I love the crafting and the gathering and the all of that. I love the Atelier series. I am stoked. Like I destroyed Atelier Marie when it came out a few weeks ago, or maybe even a few months ago, whatever that was. I beat it twice back to back in just a handful of days, and that's sort of what I like about those games. Is you could almost say they're JRPGs light, but those games in the way that an RPG should, and that I love about Japanese video games in general, is those games go as deep as you want to go with them. So like the crafting and the customization within the crafting goes and the customization within the crafting as far as the gathering goes and the grinding from random encounters goes, that goes so deep, so much deeper than I'm really ever willing to venture into any video game. I mentioned that with Disgaea, that Disgaea goes infinitely deep as far as your character development. And if you don't know, the reason it goes infinitely deep is you can get to max level. I believe max level is either 999 or 9,999. And then at any point between level 2 and max level, you can restart your character with increasing scaling percentages of your stats. So I mean, you can get infinitely powerful in Disgaea, which is cool. And I've never made it to the end of the game where like maybe you want that infinitude of power for side quest or optional bosses or something. I told you I've only ever played about 5 or 6 chapters deep in those games, and I find myself hundreds of hours in the item world, the randomly generated dungeons. And then the combat system itself becomes tedious to me because, and maybe I'm the only person that thinks of it this way, but so much of, again, JRPG is so much, it's about the video game aspect. It's about the game. It's about the gameplay loop of the combat. So many JRPGs only have the one gameplay loop of combat. That's why I say, like, it's hard not to include in the conversation about JRPGs, like the crafting, the harvesting, the homesteading elements that have become so popular today, because, and why I think that the franchises that introduced those to the broad RPG or broad JRPG are really what belong in the big 3 if you're only going to have 3. And so I don't know if maybe Atelier should replace Tales, but I think that would be silly because I don't think enough people have played the Atelier games maybe for them to be among the big 3. But if you look online, they have the following, and clearly they don't have the following necessary to be in the big 3. Actually, I have to disqualify them for their lacking English voiceover. That they don't have English voiceover means that they expect their audience to be the kind of people that don't want English voiceover, which means they don't expect mass crossover appeal. And I suppose that's what has allowed their games to remain so niche, and in a lot of ways what's allowed their games to remain so turn-based, or at least so focused on trying to maintain the turn-based style combat. Because a Western RPG doesn't rely on the turn-based combat, but I'm going to insist that the turn-based, because if you're going to include Pokemon, the turn-based is what people think is JRPG about it. Like, that's what they think is J about it. And so maybe I just wanted to... Maybe... Atelier's just been running for so long, since the first PlayStation. It's been running for so long, and it has inspired so many games. So many games. Their basic crafting setup is the basic crafting setup for, well, maybe when I say so many games, what I mean is so many indie games. So many indie games, and maybe the reason that I'm saying that so many indie games are aping what they do is because there is so little mass crossover that you can rip off the Atelier series and nobody would know that you've made an Atelier game with a male protagonist and just called it something else. It can be exactly the same and no one will know or say anything about it. And I think Iris actually had a male protagonist. Iris is the first one that I played, and I cannot wait. I've heard that there's an Iris, that they're remaking that whole original slate, so I can't wait. In a lot of ways, I'm not playing Sophie and the later ones. I have Sophie and I have the 3 Rises. I beat Ryza. Ryza's excellent. Ryza 2 is excellent. I haven't booted up Ryza 3, and a lot of the reason. I also have Liddy and Maruru, I think is what it's called. I have I've played Rorona. I've played so many of these titles. I've played so many of the Hyperdimension Neptunia titles too that my love and my bias really wants me to include them in the big 3, but like, just because they have really dedicated niche followings, and I wouldn't even say they have niche followings but I'm way off topic if what I'm trying to do is justify that Hyperdimension Neptunia because it's gotten crossover releases and it has a PC following because you can mod it to make the girls naked. That's not the same as Zelda. Like, that's not the same. It doesn't have the same broad appeal. It doesn't have the same, because the other thing about the big 3 as far as these anime is they also have name cachet, I suppose. So when you say Naruto or you say One Piece or Bleach, people know what you're talking about even if they haven't watched it or read it. And so, like, I'm pretty confident that Atelier, Hyperdimension, Neptunia are titles that only fans of the JRPG market have heard of, and that disqualifies you automatically. It almost disqualifies you. Tales is almost disqualified for that reason, because I had never heard of Tales until Xillia. And I hated Xillia so much, I could not tell you how much I hated Xillia. But a lot of why I hated Xillia is I was at that point in my life where the core gameplay loop, or I was at the point in my life where I had recognized those things that make a JRPG, and I had grown embarrassed that I like JRPGs, so I wanted them to be more like Western RPGs, so I became critical in that way that Western gatekeeping of the RPG brand encouraged me to behave for about a decade of my life, and then now I've been revisiting, and where a lot of this comes from is I've been revisiting those games that I missed in the space, and then the games that I missed on either end of what I actually had access to, because it turns out I had access to a really narrow window of games. And so, like, part of what I'm thinking about as I'm thinking about JRPGs is I was thinking, and I still may, you'll know by the time you hear this what I've decided to pair it with, but I've been thinking about going back to Final Fantasy for my Let's Plays. I have a lot of... I'm done with Brotato for a while. I need to take a break. I've beaten it with every character. I said that last time, and trying to go back and beat it on difficulty 5 so soon after having done that, I'm too exhausted. I hit about wave 13, and I just panic and die, and then I get so frustrated that I do it 6 more times on wave 9, and then I finally get back to 13 and panic and die because I'm so excited to be there. It's like I need to take a break. And so I've been thinking that maybe what I don't want to play for you, for the audience, maybe what I don't want to play for myself as I'm recording is more roguelites. But then I was looking through my collection last night, and I have a massive collection of JRPGs and roguelites. And I'm realizing as I'm talking now and I'm thinking through two things. One, I might go back to playing Dead Cells because I still have a lot of work in that game to unlock. I could do that while recording because I'm not bad at that game. And what I'm realizing is that I may have left out an entire series, an entire genre of JRPGs that no one talks about that are actually really excellent. They're entirely JRPGs, and they're first person, which is a style of RPG in the West that's been gone since the 90s. That went away once RPGs left the PC market, jumped onto the Xbox market, and then came back. Now they're back to the PC market, but they forgot first person RPGs. And so I haven't included a single mention of one first-person RPG. And I think that might be out of that earlier embarrassment. I like to play the ecchi or the moe anime JRPGs just because I'm easily amused and don't care what you think about me in a sort of passive way. But like the Crystal Moero Chronicle, those games were excellent first-person games, and in a way, they're a perfection on what people think is the Pokemon, what makes Pokemon an RPG. So, like, your main character in at least one of them, I think both of them actually, doesn't actually develop. The idea is that you're collecting these monster girls, right? And you're leveling up these monster girls, but you also have I don't know if you call it relationship goals, but you have this relationship meter with each girl that you're trying to level up, in addition to giving them items, in addition to all these other tons of mini games associated with the girls. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to take Pokemon, and they're trying to take the JRPG skins off of it and take the collectathon element out of it, and take the trading and the science and the bug thing, like the bug collecting, out of it, and put it back into a JRPG setting. And so I've almost talked myself into believing that Pokemon is a JRPG again, even though I don't believe that. I do believe that it's a different thing with JRPG elements. They took the core gameplay loops, or the core gameplay elements of a JRPG, and they made them a different thing. And great for them, but Pokemon cannot be in the top 3 of JRPGs. It just not top 3, big 3 of JRPGs. It just can't, because it's including it and including Final Fantasy and Dragon Ball together. Those 3 are very misleading about what JRPGs are actually like, because JRPGs haven't been like Final Fantasy hasn't been like other JRPGs since 10. And wasn't like other JRPGs at 10. And in fact, Final Fantasy was always ahead of the curve deciding what JRPGs were like to begin with. Everybody was trying to keep up with what Final Fantasy was doing. Dragon Quest can't be one of the big 3. To circle back through my argument to double check that it's right, Dragon Quest can't be, because there aren't enough titles. It's getting a major renaissance now. There are a lot of titles that are coming out lately, but the people that like JRPGs have been like me, as regards Dragon Quest, who aren't already massive fans of the particular story loop that is them, but they're so kiddie. And I realized in complaining, and I knew that complaining about this was going to get me in trouble, but I realized in complaining about the dancer, the male dancer character, who's obviously queer-coded, whether he's gay or asexual or not, he's obviously queer-coded. And people that like that game like that character. Of course they like that character, they like that game, and they like this silly kind of presentation of serious world issues. But what I took umbrage with wasn't the character, it was with the design development to make that character the surrogate main character when the main character was dead, and to remove you from the core gameplay loop of fighting evil to, well, just gay the pain away. And I realized, after having said that, and after knowing what I meant by it, and after knowing how other people were going to react to that, that I'm making a negative about saying that gay people are bad when I'm not in fact saying gay people are bad. What that section of that game is telling you is if you just act gay, then all of your problems go away. And I understand that to a stupid person, that's just an okay thing to say. But what it really is it's a non-Western person pandering to the acceptance of flamboyant homosexuality, or at least flamboyant girl acting likeness among boys, that they're now allowed to. It's an accepting, but it's an accepting in the same way that Dragon Ball has blackface. Like, it's still homophobic. Like, they are being homophobic in that game by saying that you can defeat the big evil by being gay. I just found that so pandering that I turned off the game and never came back to it. I don't know if the hero actually is dead. Of course he's not, but I just could not care less. And what I'm trying to say is that shallow engagement with the subject matter at hand. I couldn't get through, I think it was 8. I couldn't get through 8 because the subject matter, the engagement with the subject matter was so shallow. And I remember reading a review, I believe it was for the most recent one. It might have been for 10, I think. I don't know what number. I think it was the most recent one, who talked about how, the characters are really colorful and every town is themed, and that's really cool. But we, fantasy RPG gamers have been tired of the themed town and colorful characters as the only motif to keep us playing for a decade. So it's like Dragon Quest can't be among the big three because its motifs are a decade old. And Naruto and One Piece and Bleach are constantly at least trying to evolve to update their material for the time. And so I suppose what I was trying to do by introducing that franchise was maybe try to disqualify Tales. By disqualifying Dragon Quest, maybe I was trying to disqualify Tales, but Tales goes there. And Tales is, like, what I hated about Zillia was how hard it was trying to make the female characters sexually active, but also badass. And so my memory, could be very wrong, but my memory was having a hyper sexually aggressive 6-year-old female character and being like, okay, you've overcorrected too far. But that also seems to be a Japan thing. That Japan, a JRPG thing. It seems to be a Japan thing when they make materia for the West. When they make entertainment media for the West, they seem to make fundamental mistakes like that because their culture isn't Western. And so the JRPG, I think, has to be confused. It has to be a confusion of Western and specifically Japanese. And so I wonder if that isn't what excludes Atelier, because isn't Atelier made by a Chinese company? So doesn't that exclude it from being a JRPG, in fact? Like, you can I was wondering about this. I took a break for about 30 minutes to see if I had any new thoughts on this, and really to double check back on my thoughts, to say them again out loud. And I was wondering if whether a Western company, like if BioWare couldn't make a JRPG in the same way that like Western studios make anime, or is JRPG the animification of a Western thing? So is it like anime Spider-Man? Is the JRPG medium anime Spider-Man? And the answer might be yes. And so the JRPG might just be a flawed medium in the first place. It might, and what I like about it, what I've always loved about JRPGs, might be specifically the Western fantasy reinterpreted through a Japanese lens, because they love the genre so much that they want to reinterpret it with their culture and their lens and then sell it back to us. As a sort of imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, as a sort of flattery of how cool Tolkien is, or how cool, in fact, European mythology is. And the only places that I was able to find European mythology treated and handled with the care and the respect and the imitation that equals flattery was in JRPG, because Western RPGs are very disrespectful of their source material now, because they're college students, and we've had this conversation about how college students are taught to be disrespectful of the culture in which they live. Maybe I haven't talked about that. Maybe when I said that it takes 30 years, that's why, is because we spend the first 30 years of our lives disrespecting, or not even the first 30, the first 40 to 50 years of our lives disrespecting the culture in which we live, and then it takes that 3 decades of separation from our 20s or from our teens to look back on them in any kind of meaningful way. Most people aren't looking back on their teens in their teens, and most certainly not in their 20s, and then again not in their 30s. And when you're in your 40s, what you're looking back on your 20s is to figure out why the fuck your marriage and your life are so fucked up. You're not worried about your teens. It's not till you have teenage grandchildren that you're remembering what it was like to be a teenager, because when you're in your 30s and you have a teenager, you're too close to the teenager to remember what it was like to be a teenager. And that goes back to the division of people, right? Parent, self, former, teen. And so I feel like I've wandered way. I don't remember how I got to where I was, so I don't remember where exactly I was. I was thinking about JRPG as an imitation of a purely Western art form, And so in a lot of ways, it's like an ink painting of an alpine landscape. It's like, well, they've never been to the Alps. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not a negative criticism. In fact, I believe that what I said specifically is that I like that about it, is that I like the being able to see my culture reflected back to me through this other culture's lens. And I guess that's where Shin Megami Tensei comes in, because Shin Megami Tensei is almost a unifying theory of everything about mythology playing out with Japan as the center of the universe. Not just Japan, isn't it Tokyo? Doesn't it take place in Tokyo? Or maybe I just don't understand. Maybe I don't understand. I thought that the fifth one took place in like a suburb of Tokyo. Maybe it takes the suburb of Kyoto. Maybe I'm just confused and I don't know Japanese geography at all. I couldn't tell you. But I'm not sure that the Shin Megami Tensei series can be in the big, because until 5, it was extremely niche. Extremely. Especially in the West. In Persona, the whole protagonist having to shoot themselves with a metaphorical gun to summon their personas to do damage in combat was that was a bridge too far for me in 3. I had to quit playing 3 because I was unwilling to cast my spells, because I didn't like seeing the animation over and over. I just didn't like seeing it. It's meant to be disturbing because they're meant to be horror games. And so, and thinking about horror games has me thinking about like the Mary Skelter games. And that has me thinking about JRPGs for girls, and that there is a very distinct attempt by the developers to encourage girls to play JRPGs. And that's what I'm thinking about, is maybe I'm wondering if I haven't included one of these that like is girl friendly, because I haven't played enough of the East series to really stand firm on that conclusion. And girls love Zelda, and girls love girls really like the Tales series too. Girls really like Zelda, and girls really like the JRPGs that are heavy on the RP. They like the Atelier series. They like Hyperdimension Neptunia. And I've been trying to reverse engineer what it is that girls like about JRPGs. And what it is about the JRPG medium that seems to be more inviting to girls, or at least that the developers seem to think is more inviting to them than the Western. Because like there's still the perception that girls don't like or aren't meant to like, because girls frankly love the Elder Scrolls games. In fact, I know way more women that play Elder Scrolls than men. But there's this perception that girls aren't meant to like the Fallout series, which again, girls love. Girls love the Bethesda titles, and it's the RP. It's the RP. It's games that have a G. Girls are less inclined to love. So it's like Harvest Moon, Rune Factory, Harvestella. Like the push now toward Japanese, or at least JRPG developers, to like go into the cozy game, which is what I'm associating with the cozy elements, or what I'm calling like the Atelier stuff. Why I'm saying that Atelier deserves on the list, because the push right now is to get girls to play JRPGs, and so you can really tell the difference. So like Hyperdimension Neptunia is so obviously for girls. There's just so much talking, and it's so about nothing, and it's beautiful and lovely, and most of it's really funny. But then Fairy Fencer is obviously supposed to be for boys, and it's the exact same setup. You have a bunch of girls, you're trying to make them more powerful, and you're allergic to girls, so it's obviously not sexual, but it's pretty girls being pretty, and pretty girls are pretty and mostly naked when it's targeted at girls, and they're pretty, and they'll allow you to do upskirts if it's for boys. They usually don't let you do upskirts in games for girls. So like the Atelier games won't let you position the camera in such a way that you can see the girl's underwear, but Hyperdimension Neptunia doesn't care, and Fairy Fencer, all of the Carol's character models are designed so that you can see their panties. But then, like, the speaking of action RPGs, I don't know, because it's not a series, but I don't know that Yoko Taro doesn't belong in this conversation with the dragon. Oh my goodness, I just forgot the name of that series. Holy crap, that's one of my very very favorite series, and I just forgot. It just completely slipped my mind. But anyway, Nier Automata most specifically is what I'm talking about, where like if you upskirt on 2B long enough, she'll kick the camera away. Or in the original Nier, I don't remember her name, but the girl would attack the camera if you had it too close, or if you tried to upskirt for too long. But then you can also self-destruct 2B and just destroy her skirt, and then the game doesn't care if you do, intense upskirts or intense crotch shots. So clearly they knew that boys were going to play, and that boys were going to do that. So there is a difference. And so I wonder if, because the big three, Naruto, One Piece, and Bleach, skew really heavily toward a male audience. Really heavily toward a male audience. Now I know that girls are allowed to like One Piece and Bleach and Naruto, but of those three, only Bleach, as far as I'm aware, has a large female fan base. I know that girls like Naruto and One Piece, and I know that girls like to capitalize on cosplaying as characters from those games. But in my personal anecdotal experience, I have met exactly 0 females that watch those shows, and the females that I know that habitually watch anime, the only long-running shonen type show that they do watch is Bleach, because Bleach leans more heavily toward the storytelling that a female audience would like. It's more emotional, I suppose, is how a Western 90s audience would say it. Like Final Fantasy VI, I read recently a contemporary American review that called it mushy, like lovey-dovey. And that all that emotion didn't fly in the American milieu. Which the change really goes to speak to who your core demographics are, because like Dragon Age, the Dragon Age franchise, beloved of women. Girls love that shit. Mass Effect, beloved of women. These the cross genre RPG titles, Horizon Zero Dawn, beloved of women. Women really like these Western RPGs that are crossover, that are genre blending RPGs. And a lot of the reason is because they're genre blending. So because they're blended, they're not a space that's already occupied by toxic males. I can totally understand that, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. But there's also something to the fact that, like, I skip these cutscenes and have no interest whatsoever in the romance. I do the romance because you need it in order to get a good ending. But, like, I remember being wildly annoyed with Dragon Age 2. Isn't that what it was called? When the Dragon Age Origins and Dragon Age 2 and then Dragon Age Inquisition? Or did Dragon Age 2 have a... did it have a subtitle as well? I don't remember. But I remember being wildly annoyed that I romanced the guy that ends up being the villain like an idiot. I also always play female characters because the female love interests are always fucking annoying. And then I always find myself annoyed because I'm not actually romantically interested in these males. I'm just picking a male to be romantically interested in because I have to, because I chose to play a female character. So a lot of my dissatisfaction with these games, like Dragon Age, specifically the Dragon Age franchise, like writ large, but also Mass Effect, is that I play female characters in these games that not just want, that need you to take a romantic love interest. But anyway, in Dragon Age 2, I remember taking the guy that ends up being the villain, and then I think I actually killed him, but the game's epilogue gave me a "they lived happily ever after," but there was a horrible dramatic scene of me killing him with my bare hands, and it just did not mention that in the epilogue, and so it made my choice of romantic interest of waste of my fucking time. And they do that a lot. Mass Effect did that to me between Mass Effect 1 and 2, and then again between 2 and 3, and then so I have in Brotato terms, I have negative 100% interest in Baldur's Gate 3 for that very reason. That all of the promotional material is you can fuck a bear if you want. That is just I have no interest in that shit. I'm trying to think of another Western RPG that I tried to play recently that was a sequel. It's on the Switch. Maybe I'll record myself playing it. I have brought it up, but I need some feedback from you guys from what else you want to watch me play while I talk over, because it doesn't make sense to me to play anything that has dialogue or text boxes that are a story, a narrative for you to try to follow along with while I play it. My instinct is to play the original Final Fantasies. I would like to play 2 because I love 2, and I would really like to talk about why after having played several hours or maybe the entire game, but it's not about the narrative, and I don't want to demonstrate the narrative for you. So if I recorded myself playing a narrative-heavy RPG, I would only want to show the combat loop, because or at least the gameplay loops, because the narrative is the last thing that I'm playing a JRPG for, because of what I was talking about with the reinterpreting through a Japanese lens. The dialogue boxes have gotten out of control since the PlayStation 2. Just the amount of exposition and talky talks that go on in JRPGs has gotten completely out of control, and that's another thing that makes a JRPG, another element of a JRPG that makes a JRPG that Pokemon doesn't fall into, and that Final Fantasy and that Dragon Quest don't fall into, is the I believe they're called visual novels. The visual novel aspect of modern JRPG. If you buy a JRPG, you can just expect to see 2 anime 2-dimensional characters standing presented on either side of the screen with dialogue boxes between them, and them flipping through still images of their emotion as the conversation goes on for many, many, many minutes longer than what was necessary, because they're not animating the dialogue, so you don't have to be efficient with it. You don't have to use any kind of economy of storytelling. And so Japanese JRPGs also, they have no economy of storytelling. So if in doing this we're also critiquing the genre, in a lot of ways I suppose that's what I'm doing. They're typified by an absolute dearth of economy of storytelling, and a lot of that is because of what a JRPG is, and sort of what the goal or the challenges that are set before you when you choose to make a JRPG. So when you choose to make a JRPG, or when you choose to make an RPG, you have a 60-hour benchmark. And I don't know why 60 hours is the mark, but 60 hours is the mark. That's what we decided in the 90s. I know that I wouldn't buy a game if the boxes used to tell you the estimated hours playtime in a game, and I wouldn't buy a game that the number was smaller than 40, but 60 was what I was looking for. especially in an RPG, and particularly in a JRPG. And so a lot of what's going on, because of the medium, the genre, because of the things that the audience have determined are necessary, there's a lot of padding. And so JRPGs are analogous to anime, especially to shonen anime, and in that padding thing that you're going to get a lot of unnecessary filler. And so a lot of that unnecessary filler is having a big world with lots of cities to explore. And so Final Fantasy, having played all of the... Did I get his name right when I said Yoshinori Kitase? Having played the first 10 extensively now, having beaten the first 6 now, all of them multiple times. Final Fantasy tries to justify every point of interest on the map with at least some quest, some story element. And even if it's story element at point X on the map, lots and lots and lots and lots of random encounters, story element at point Y on the map, and then those two things maybe don't lead to a Z or from a WX. Yeah, I got it right. But like the first Final Fantasy is strung together by a series of quests. Your broad goal is to heal the crystals, and then you're led to the crystals by a series of broad fetch quests for the most part. And 2 is largely the same. There's a political story going on behind it, but you hit all of the access points to make the story move by going through a long series of combat encounters. And then 2 introduce a little bit more of a dialogue Western style thing where you have to like engage with characters and talk to characters. But for the most part in the Final Fantasy series, you advance by the role playing that you do is talking to NPCs, just getting the information of the world from NPCs, and then the game is going from point of interest, exploring the world and getting a broader understanding of the evolution and the further twists and turns of the story as it's being presented to you. That's not what Western RPGs are like at all. Like, that isn't what Skyrim is like at all. And so that's what I mean by linearity, and that's what Western people criticize when they talk about the game being too linear, is the game takes you from quest to quest to quest, main quest, story quest as we understand it now from MMOs. Story quest, we go quest to quest to quest to quest to quest to quest. And each stop doesn't have optional stuff to do. So, like, when you play The Witcher 3 now, you do your story quest and you have a near infinite number of side quests to do in that town. Or, like, I've been thinking about maybe what I'll do is I'll play Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, because that's a game I really like. And haven't played for a long time, and haven't really had the justification to go back and beat it on the hardest difficulty, like to put up with the difficulty, the frustration, because I don't need the vanity, and I'm on the Switch, I can't get achievements, which I hate. Nintendo, fix that. Why is yours the only platform to play video games on that I don't have achievements that I can share with and compare against my friends? Fix that. Damn it. Or maybe I'd just be mad at Steam for introducing the concept in the first place. Or maybe I just need to be annoyed with individual developers that they don't have the achievements just baked into the code of the game. I don't know. I hate it that I don't have any reason to play video games twice on the Switch. I don't have goals built into the game after I've beaten it. I hate that. That's annoying. JRPGs have gotten better, but they've gotten better at that by leaning harder into what makes Western RPGs sell well. And so I know that I've said my 3 titles about a half hour ago, and that now I've just been waffling and double checking my terminology and seeing if I can stretch this out to 215 like I usually do, so I don't have to worry about if I have a winning run in Brotato that's fewer than 60 minutes long, which is what I was thinking about at the 45-minute mark 45 minutes ago. So when I come back to it and I circle back around it, I ask myself, do I agree with Ys as the action adventure title? I haven't played enough of them to know whether the town building and harvesting, farming, self-sufficiency thing is in all of them, but it's most certainly in 10. I've played a little bit of 10. That's another one that's another series that I get to play in it, and then I get to thinking, like, maybe I need to just be recording myself to get through this, because Ys is so like Zelda in that you just explore Ys 10 anyway. I think that's the one I'm playing. I'm playing Lacrimosa of Dana. And playing is a strong word for what I'm doing. Played for several hours one time a few weeks ago is what I did. And it's very much like the old school. Well, it's very much an old school JRPG, and I like that. I like that it stayed old school. And so I don't know how many of the... I also own Origins, but those are the... I think 11. I think I own 11 too, but I don't think I've installed it. Because I wanted to beat 10, and I wanted to see if, because they put Origins, maybe they were going to put, the first 9 on the Switch. But I believe that the company that owns the first 9 titles might have told fans and gamers to get fucked, even though the other companies that cannibalized the company that originally made Ys are remaking all of their titles. So who fucking knows? Who knows? The video game industry is so confused and so confusing right now. It's like there are enough people my age that really, really want to play these old titles that they missed out on, that they would sell, but they wouldn't sell well enough to justify the huge number of people it requires to actually go through the brute force of remaking what was at the time a AAA game. So it's a conundrum. Really, it's not. It really isn't. There are enough people with degrees and with the know-how and with the ability to do the thing. What there isn't is enough liquid cash flowing around in the video game industry to just have like a company that does remakes. That like there are companies that handle them, but that's not all that they do. So like even the company that did Final Fantasy, but Square Enix's Pixel Remasters, even that company within Square Enix, they make original titles. I mean, that's how you get Octopath Traveler and Triangle Strategy. And Triangle Strategy and Octopath Traveler actually are the prime examples of imitation being flattery, falling really, really short. Because those games are trying to be pure Western RPGs with JRPG sensibilities, and they fall entirely flat on what a Western RPG is. Octopath Traveler is so far removed from what we actually want it to be that it's really hard for me to play it for more than a few hours at a time. The combat making me choose every move I make like it's the most important thing in the world in trash fights is so tedious. And then the whole acquiring your party being optional or incidental to playing thing, you have to grind so much to get to I don't know. I don't know. The game is not balanced well for what it says it wants to do unless you're playing it in the easy mode. And if you're playing it in easy mode, you're offending my sensibilities as a person who played Final Fantasy, which was until 12 hard mode. But that's a different conversation. Hard mode in video games, whether video games should be difficult or not, is a different conversation, and it's really a conversation that I can wrap up quickly, because video games were hard when you had to pay quarters to play them so they could be profitable to the people that bought the machine, and they were hard when video games only sold to Blockbuster so that Blockbuster could make money off you having to rent it multiple times. So, like, difficulty in video games is an artificial part of the medium. Once cartridges and once consoles themselves, but once video gaming. I mean, if you lived the 2000s, if you're in your 30s, you lived this, you watched it happen. If you remember Dark Souls hitting the market, not even Dark Souls, Demon Souls. If you remember when Demon Souls was first being advertised, not even released. You remember that video games got really, really painfully easy for a while because you owned it. The power fantasy of playing a video game was complete by the cycle of paying the $60 for the fucking disc. There was a point where we were like, $50, $60 for a game just to punish me over and over and over, and I never get to enjoy it, and all of my, and it being a skill thing, like video games being a skill, and gate kept by the skill and by score, that went away when we hated that. Once we were buying them and they were staying in our homes. And then skill and difficulty became a thing, became a point of pride. But there were always difficult games. Like when I was talking about that 60-hour padding and having lots of places to go, the other way that you padded your game was by requiring a lot of grinding. So the first 7 or 8, 9, 10 Final Fantasies really, and this is something about retro games that I'm finding in general, especially in remakes, that make them easier and more accessible to a modern audience that doesn't play JRPGs and doesn't have 100 hours to sink into one video game because they don't want to fall that far behind in the dialogue of the most important new games that have come out. So games are no longer trying to be long, and so JRPGs almost disincline people to buy them because they know that you're going to have to sit down for 60 hours with a JRPG. When I was talking about Disgaea, like, that you're sitting down for an infinite amount of time with this game. But JRPGs, there are also RPGs that are made with the sentiment of Kingdom Hearts, where they want to be the only game you play that year. And so lots of grinding but it's built into the way that the game is presented, that you end up spending a lot of time in or around a town, these points of interest, because you're supposed to be grinding in them. So like in the original Final Fantasy, the first, you end up getting really well acquainted with the dungeons, and like people make fun of me that I still remember, I can still path most of the dungeons in Final Fantasy VI right to their end through memory, because you end up spending a lot of time in them, and so there being multiple kinds of games, JRPG developers suffer from people wanting to do like the Mario thing, where you hop among the different worlds and you can go wherever you want, and you can play the different stages again, and you don't have to grind, but you have to practice. But I'm way off what I'm talking about. I don't even remember. I know that I've wandered away from any kind of cogent thought. I'm comparing things that don't make sense to compare in the sense and the context of whether Ys belongs on the list. But I think that Ys might be a good example of the action RPG genre, because it's old, it's been around forever, and people play it. It's a good way to introduce people to the idea of the action RPG, because Ys is Monster Hunter, but with people. more obviously with and about people, like you have a party and you have all these relationships, etc. And I don't know that Monster Hunter isn't fundamentally an RPG. And so I don't know that maybe Monster Hunter isn't the better example to put here, or like, and I'm pretty sure that all three of these are from the same company, but like the Warriors, like Dynasty Warriors, might actually be a better example of the action JRPG genre, if I'm thinking in those terms. But if I'm trying to include as many different aspects of Japanese gaming in one title as possible, I think that East 10, at least, is a good example of the self-sufficiency, the farming, the crafting, the making your own weapons, the improving, the stuff that you've got, and the relationships, the friends, the neighbors, the family, the town that you're developing out, that it can encompass Atelier, Harvest Moon, Dynasty Warriors, Kingdom Hearts, all of those kind of games. Devil May Cry, Bayonetta. I'm trying to see how broad my knowledge of this genre is, and whether I'm just too broadly ignorant of the genre to even have this conversation, which is not what you do an hour and 45 minutes into a conversation. And so I think Ys is right. I think Ys is right because Ys is Zelda enough that I don't have two Nintendo titles, because I went through and I agree with Fire Emblem enough that I don't think I need to qualify it again, because enough people play it, it's anime enough, kids love it, enough said. And then people love Dragon Quest, and I really appreciate that people love Dragon Quest and that Dragon Quest does big numbers. And I really appreciate that Final Fantasy is a long series and it's a brand that still exists, but Final Fantasy hasn't existed since the original director. Final Fantasy hasn't been Final Fantasy since the original director left. So I don't count Final Fantasy anymore among even franchises. So Tales. I still think I agree with Tales. Tales needs to release another one soon for me to agree wholeheartedly with that. But they recently released the one Symphonia that everyone loves. And so that counts enough as like Naruto doing a more succinct, updated version of, the original manga run or whatever, sort of like what Brotherhood is to Fullmetal Alchemist. Sort of. They're not one for one, but we're not talking in one for ones. And so there was a franchise that I thought of in my mind. I may have said it out loud. That makes me wonder whether there doesn't need to be a fourth category altogether. Like that just needs to be the big four. But since we're sticking to anime, there isn't a big four. If there were a big four, it would obviously be Dragon Ball, Dragon Ball Z, the Dragon Ball continuity, and I've already said that Final Fantasy is that. So have I said everything that I want to say? Have I said everything on this subject that there is to say? Everything I thought I've thought? Probably not. First-person RPGs. First-person, specifically dungeon crawlers. because there are a lot of those now, like the university games where you are a teacher developing in short windows classes of RPG characters where you've transcended even being in a party, where what's important about you and how you're important to the game is how you develop these people to go out on their imaginary adventures. Like, that is its own genre of JRPG, the school game, and that's sort of where I was when I was talking Shin Megami Tensei Persona, because there are a fuckload of Shin Megami Tensei / Persona ripoffs. And now, I mentioned NIS. I mentioned the NIS in Nippon Ichi Software, and NIS is they're the damn Kmart of excellent knockoff games. Like, they take a base premise of one major AAA title, turn it into a AA or a single A game, or even a B game, and take the gameplay that was in the AAA game and just turn it up to 11. And if it was at 11, they turn it up to 22. It's incredible what NIS is able to do with just playable, functional, good games, especially in the second tier pricing market. It's really incredible. Now you'll very rarely be able to have conversations with people about NIS's games, but I'm thinking about Void Terrarium, and where games like Void Terrarium, or I think it's called Monster Cuisine, where games like that, where dungeon crawlers and loot grinders come into the trifecta. Dungeon crawling in general. But if Ys Origins is anything like the other 9 Ys games, it might also encompass that, the dungeon crawling thing, because Ys Origins, you're scaling a tower like in Persona 3, and that's a pretty common element in the dungeon crawler, the university, the loot grinding RPGs. And a lot of them are in their way aping Diablo, the loot grinder Western RPG. And the loot grinder Western RPG very frequently isn't even considered an RPG. Like most people wouldn't say that you're playing a Western RPG when you play Diablo or the games like Diablo. So maybe what I'm doing is I'm overthinking it and trying to include. But a lot of people play Japanese loot grindy games. So maybe Ys captures all of that, because my understanding of the original Ys games is that their combat was more like Gauntlet Legends, and that you just kind of like hack your way through stuff, and that's how Void Terrarium and the other games in that milieu, that genre, that milieu might be the right word actually, that style, that feel that I've played. So maybe Ys counts for that. I shouldn't include Ys. But so Ys is the loot grinding, action-y dungeon crawler JRPG, and that's One Piece. And Tales is Bleach. And so does that make... Why can't I keep all 3 of these in my head at once? Because I've chosen franchises that I don't play a lot of, but that other people play a lot of. Dang, it's gone. Where it was Ys and Tales and... You're screaming at me right now. You know what it is. I've said it so many times. Oh my goodness, I can't even... Fire Emblem. My goodness. Yeah, including 2 franchises that I've only played a few hours of was not the best choice for my memory. But I'm trying to be fair. I'm trying to disregard my biases and really disregard the biases of the average Western gamer and really get to the heart of what's played. Not just played by the West, but what's actually played in the East as well. And it really, whether it's because it's the big 3, right? It doesn't have to be the best selling, and it doesn't have to be the most influential, and it doesn't have to be the best. But I really do think that East represents that genre, and Tales represents the games that are trying to catch up with or keep up with or be spiritual successors to. Tales represents the games that want to be played when you're done playing Final Fantasy. They're the games that want to be played between Final Fantasy titles, because JRPGs expect that you're going to play one game this year. Like Xenoblade, when you buy Xenoblade Chronicles, you're expected to only play that until Xenoblade Chronicles 2 comes out. Or now that you've got Xenoblade 3, they expect you to play that until Xenoblade 4 comes out. And that's also the case with Fire Emblem. And a lot of that is what video games have learned, especially Japanese developers have learned from the MMORPG market, and how much money you can actually make in the DLC market, the aftermarket. And thus has been learned from Monster Hunter and the expansions of that and the DLC for that, but also, I don't know. I don't know I don't know why there's a different design philosophy. They've learned that people are willing to play one game so long as you're willing to update it. And so Pokemon in that way, is that it does fit into that, and that's why I say it's skinned like a JRPG. The Game Freak, I believe, are the developers, the Pokemon company. They've learned the lessons of the games that they love to play, and the games that they clearly grew up playing and the games that they clearly love to play are JRPGs. That doesn't make their game a JRPG. Anyway, that Unpacking is an action RPG. And so I'm nearing the end here, and I'm creaky, and I'm running out of ideas, and I've circled through this at least 3 times now to make sure that what I was saying is right. And I don't like not including Harvest Moon, because there's a place for it, because it inspired not just a whole generation, but it continues to inspire generations of what can be done in an RPG, and what kinds of core gameplay loops that you can have and still be playing a role-playing game. But I don't think it's analogous in the big 3. And I don't think that if I were going to make a big 4, if I were going to 2 hours, an hour and 58 minutes into this conversation, try to pivot to likening them to the big 4 of thrash metal, I think that metaphor would be too tortured to try to include another. And really, just for my closing comments now, that I think I've said everything that I had to say. My mind is increasingly empty of words, so that's the place I was trying to get to, and I'm always trying to get to when I'm recording these. My closing thoughts are that I'm stoked that Nintendo and Squaresoft and Square Enix, by extension, have been able to work out their differences, and Super Mario RPG is coming to the Switch. That is and has been for a very long time my absolute most very favoritist RPG ever, maybe even my very most favoriteest video game ever. It was the first one I ever bought in the box. I thought I was the coolest kid in the world. The second game I ever bought in the box was Breath of Fire 3. I already know from what little I've watched of it that I'm going to be disappointed by the remaster. I think they could have done more to make it look more modern, but I'm also going to be charmed by how much it looks like I remember from my childhood, but only in a better resolution. So what I need to do is hope and pray that the company that makes Triangle Strategy is hired by Nintendo because pre-orders were high enough to make the next Paper Mario game, and that the next Paper Mario game isn't boring and doesn't have no RPG elements. Because Paper Mario is supposed to be the spiritual successor to Mario RPG, Super Mario RPG, and every installment of Paper Mario. I've only played the one that's on the Switch, the Origami King, I believe it's called, and the one that's available on the 64 emulator. I think that's the first Paper Mario. I haven't beaten either of them. I think I'm at the second to last boss, maybe the second to last world, I don't know, of Origami King. I got bored. I hated the combat system and the combat system for the boss fights. Just, I don't like losing, and I don't like doing a fight in a video game, a combat encounter, more than a few times. And I really don't like games where I'm not allowed to grind. Like, I'm not allowed to, okay, well, fine, if I can't figure out how to do this, I can at least make myself more powerful so I can take a few more hits while I figure it out. And you can't do that in Paper Mario. There's another game that I recently played, another Chrono Trigger alike, that had that problem where it had specific number. It had spawns. The enemies spawned, but when you left and came back into a room, they didn't respawn. So there were only a specific number of enemies that you could fight at any moment, and so you could never even get even with the combat encounters. And I understand that, like I was saying, that there's a difficulty that you're trying to achieve with the JRPG style game. And when you're a Western developer making a JRPG, you're lacking a lot of institutional memory, and so what you don't understand is that the difficulty is optional. Like Final Fantasy VI had an optional difficulty scaling in that your characters didn't gain base statistics every level. They only gained statistics when they were carrying an Esper, and so that has a difficulty built into it, where you don't want to get too powerful before you have the Espers that you want to level, but you also don't want to be so weak that every trash and combat encounter is a boss fight. And that leads us back to why I don't like Octopath Traveler. Is it's like you can largely skip the trash and Octopath Traveler. The game is pretty generous about that. You can get right to the boss fights, but then there are boss fights that are so difficult that there's nothing that even accurately managing the weaknesses, there's nothing you can do until you're at a certain level appropriate to the boss, which means grinding out the gear, which means that you can what's the word I'm trying to, you have level caps that you have to achieve, which means that you have to spend a certain amount of time grinding and leveling, which is back to the JRPG element, that there's a certain amount of management that you have to do. There's a certain amount of character development that you're forced to engage with because it's a JRPG. And that puts us at the 2 hours and 3 minute mark. And I think that I've said everything that I have to say about the conversation of what should be the big three JRPGs, what makes a JRPG. And I haven't really said anything about what JRPGs need to do better, because JRPGs right now are having a little bit of a heyday. There are a lot of good ones coming out. There are a lot of them that are being released by Western markets that are going to do poorly, which means that NIS and the good companies are going to swoop in and figure out what they've done wrong and make even better ones. Dragon Quest has 3 releases this year, which kind of undermines my idea that Dragon Quest should be in the big 3, but it also underscores it in that they're all 3 in different genres. They're all in some form of JRPG genre, and also it being them having a monster game, a Pokemon alike, does really underscore the question of whether Pokemon is a JRPG or not, because Squeenix is telling you that whether it's a JRPG or not, they're going to use their particular JRPG skin to make one. So our monster hunters, where your monster tamers, monster catchers, are those RPGs, and are they specifically JRPGs? I don't know, but I'll tell you that I think the developers think that they are. The developers have the sense that they're at least making something in a JRPG skin, even if the insides are something else. I do prefer monster hunters that are JRPGs. I think that you can tell the difference between a JRPG that's wearing a Monster Hunter skin and a Monster Hunter that's wearing a JRPG skin by the enemies. So if like the Moero games, if you catch your monsters, your party members, and they are distinct from the enemies in the game, that's a JRPG. And if you catch your monsters from the enemies of the game, like you tame the enemies of the game, I think that's a Monster Hunter, and I think that that's distinct. So like Final Fantasy Maxima might not be a JRPG, it might be a Monster Hunter in a Final Fantasy skin. And I'm convinced, and having played 15 minutes of Final Fantasy Maxima, it's called Final Fantasy something else, Final Fantasy Family or something like that, but Maxima is the big thing that I see on the icon on the Switch. That was most certainly meant to be the Final Fantasy part of Kingdom Hearts 3, and then Kingdom Hearts 3 got too bloated, and they were like, we can't put a game on 2 discs in this generation of games, so this has to be 2 different games now. Final Fantasy Worlds, is that what it's called? I am certain that game was meant to be the Final Fantasy element to Kingdom Hearts 3, because Kingdom Hearts 3 has no Final Fantasy element. There are no Final Fantasy characters in Kingdom Hearts 3. In fact, when I beat Kingdom Hearts 3, I thought for sure that was the midway part of the game. That was when the twist was going to come and all the Final Fantasy characters were going to show up and the game was going to become Kingdom Hearts. But instead, I got Kingdom Hearts 3, which is a game I love and can't play because, for whatever reason, it's only the streaming version on the Switch, and my internet isn't fast enough to stay connected long enough to not watch my character run around in circles and get disconnected. So that's fun and lame. And I think that's really all there is to talk about the conversation of JRPGs and the big 3. I think I've run out. I want to know. I love NIS's what NIS is doing. I want to know how seriously Squeenix is thinking about selling out to Xbox or to Microsoft, because that would be insane. I think that's just rumors because they sold all of their American studios, because it turns out Japanese companies aren't good at making American games. Weird. And I meant, when I said American studios, I meant Western studios, and when I said American games, I meant Western games. Turns out they're not very good at making games with European protagonists behaving like Europeans in non-European environments. It all just feels very racist, and I wonder how they would feel about us making a Japanese character in a non-Japanese environment. I bet they would think that was pretty weird and racist. So now we're back to representation, and I don't want to talk about representation in video games. Maybe that's next episode. So anyway, you made it to the end. I've said all that I have to say on this. I can't think of anything else that I want or have wanted to say on this topic. I don't want to think about any other JRPGs that I haven't missed, and I don't want to start over recalculating what I've said from the beginning. So I've said everything I have to say. It's 2 hours and 8 minutes. You're awesome for making it this far. Thank you so much, and I'll talk at you again later.